Hello, so this is my video about Popular History of Ireland by Thomas McGee. Took me a long time to do this because it's 2,000 pages. Here, I'll show you. There's the book on my website there. It's 2,114 pages, 31 hours, 19 minutes, and 33 seconds. So there's my web page for it on my website. It has 12 books, and yeah, it's really big. So I'll just do a rundown on it, and then I get to do another book. I don't know why I started with this book. It's a huge book. So my idea, my general mission statement for these is just keep it as informal as you possibly can, so to encourage that you actually do it, and it doesn't really hurt and also to make it raw, to get into the habit of just exposing, what you really know about something, and no more and no less. So let's get into it. It was I was busy doing other things, but I think if you're pretty much busy all day long, you can get through about 500 pages a day if somebody reads the book to you. The next book I'm going to do is going to be Diogenes, and I'm going to do it on my computer. I'm going to have my phone read it to me, which is a lot faster because they only have a bit of book 6 of Diogenes, so you can't even do it from LibriVox. I'll do book 6 from Diogenes, but most of it will be just me, the phone reading it to me. And the way that I do that is the phone you can't turn the screen off when it reads to you. So you just have to I put the brightness all the way down so the phone's battery doesn't die. So I'll experiment with that. Let y'all know how that goes. Hopefully I won't get any phone calls while I do this because I'm doing this with my cell phone. If I get a phone call, it cuts it out so then I can splice it together unless it's too long. So book 1 is 113 pages long, one of 12. It has 8 chapters. First inhabitants, first ages, Christians preached at Tara, Constitution and how kings kept it, a reign of Hugh to Irish colony of Scotland, obtains its independence, 600s kings, 700s kings, and then 0 to 300, what Irish schools and saints did. Okay, so when I do a video, it's hard to distinguish, what I read from the book and just my general knowledge. So this is kind of a mixture between general knowledge of a history of Ireland and the book. After I listened to the book, I did a Wikipedia article, and then I did the Wikipedia article of the Irish Famine. So, history of Ireland. Thomas McGee kind of starts with Celtic Ireland. Ireland was a Celtic. They spoke Celtic Gaelic language, kind of like the same race and language as Britain from before the Romans came, but they really don't know anything about it because the Romans never took over Ireland. They did a little bit of trade with Ireland at one point when the Romans were in charge of. Romans took over Britain in the year 40 under the fourth emperor Claudius. And the first time the Romans went there was in the 1st century BC with Julius Caesar. He just went there and beat them at battle, but then retreated and was only a legend in Ireland. Didn't leave a lasting settlements there. But what they know of Ireland, the Romans, is at one point an Irish king left Ireland and went to Britain, and then the Romans in Britain helped him gain his kingdom back in Ireland. But that's all you really know. I remember Thomas McGee saying that back in those Celtic times, there were a lot of kingdoms in Ireland. He said 2 to 3 times more the number of counties that are in Ireland. If I remember correctly, there were about maybe like if you look at the Ireland kingdoms, yeah, I'm looking at the Republic of Ireland, not the which is most of the island. The Republic of Ireland was started in 1922, but before that, England owned it for a long time. But they have 31 counties, and I looked at kind of an average size county on there, and it was about 40 kilometers in diameter. So if there were 2 to 3 times more kingdoms as counties now, then you would, if it's double, you would make it about 20 kilometers in diameter, which is about the same exact size as the Kingdom of Rome. Under the very beginning of the Kingdom of Rome, under Romulus and Latinia is about 40 kilometers in diameter, and Rome was kind of half of that. So that's about your basic size of a kingdom, about 20 kilometers in diameter. That would be like Boulder to out to Longmont, 10 kilometers away, and then out in the other direction, 10 kilometers. So it's about like what you could see, like a line of sight. If you were to build a big tower and you look around, it would be or if you have really good eyes, or if you made a telescope, it would basically, but what you could see. And a lot of times when you read history books, and if somebody's given a territory by a huge kingdom, the rule would be what you can ride your horse around in a day, and that's kind of what you could ride your horse around. But they were very warlike kingdoms. So they were pretty much independent. But I think in an island the size of Ireland, it kind of forces people to stand their ground and fight for their kingdoms, because there's kind of nowhere to go. You have to jump on a boat and leave, and so I think it helped them be very warlike. So Ireland, you can divide Ireland into like 4 different epochs or something. Ireland up until the fall of Rome and the beginning of St. Patrick, and then so that would be Celtic Ireland, and then the second part of Ireland would be the Catholic religious part of Ireland, which is in about another 400 years, and then the Viking Age, so that would be the third one, and that would be from like 800 to, Celtic would be 0 to 400. Christian Ireland would be 400 to 800. Viking Ireland would be 800 to like for a couple hundred years until like 1000, and then it would be Norman. The Normans went over and took over Ireland, so then that would be like 1000 until 1500 would be kind of like Viking Norman Ireland, and then 1500 on would be British Ireland. So as far as the first Celtic part of Ireland, they were very civilized. Ireland, out of all of the countries, they keep their king's list more intact than anybody else. I guess you don't know if it was forged or not, but they have their king's list that go way, way, way back. And I have a lot of family from Ireland, Scotland and Ireland, and I was actually able to trace my lineage all the way to Adam, because back in the year, they traced their lineage to like I don't know, 500 BC or something, until the end of the Kingdom of Judah, And then they have a legend that the daughter of the king, like daughter of King Zedekiah, I think, the last king of Judah, fled to Ireland from Israel and then became the queen there. And so if you have a, and that was traced through the McDonald's. Like I have a great grandmother or great great grandmother who was a McDonald. But yeah, and not even in that lineage. You can trace for other lineages that I did in my family all the way back to BC times. So, and if you're studying the history of Ireland, Ireland is kind of married to Scotland. A lot of the kingdoms back in the old days were took over, like were their territory was Ireland as well as Scotland and the Isles. There was a kingdom called, I think, Strathclyde, or maybe called the Kingdom of Isles. There are these islands that are between Scotland and Ireland, and that was a kingdom. I traced one of my ancestors as the king of that kingdom, but the kingdom was those islands as well, and then they had Scotland and then Ireland as well. So there was a lot of communication between Scotland and Ireland in those islands. There were seafaring people, but we don't really know, that much about ancient Ireland. There are these round tower buildings from the Stone Age, called, can't remember, but there are these big tall round castles, and then they would build wooden floors, multi-level wooden floors, and then they would go up the edges of the castle. There's these two layers of stone, and the stairs would spiral up, and that's how you would go up and down from the different floors. It sounds really beautiful. They're starting to rebuild those, but they have those all over Scotland. But I don't have any. I don't think that they existed in Ireland, so they had some kind of a different culture. But they were very warlike, and they could defend themselves against Scandinavians, I think, because they had their own Celtic culture. So then that's all I remember from that part. Now the second part of Ireland would be the Christian part of Ireland, and that was where St. Patrick comes in. The Pope sent over a Catholic preacher man before St. Patrick, and then they sent St. Patrick over, and he was very successful in converting the entire island of Ireland into Christianity. And I think he went over there in 450, and he lived over 100 years. So I think maybe he lived from like 430 to 530 or something like that. And that's where St. Patrick's Day comes from. He's still the most legendary person of Ireland. Some people think he's just a legend, but that was a big, that period of time was a big exodus of the Christian religion right at the fall of Rome. I don't think people realize, but right before the fall, like Theodosius was the last emperor of the Roman Empire who had control over all of the Roman Empire, and he was the person who converted all of Europe into Christianity. And then the Roman Empire died and Christianity took over. So it was like just in the nick of time. So there was some kind of cultural shift going on from they're realizing that their world empire was dying and they needed to replace it with a religiously based world empire. And so, the place where the religion stuck the most and was the most successful was Ireland. Some people credit Ireland with being the place that kind of saved Christianity, because they had the strongest Christian faith and Christian tradition in Ireland out of anywhere. After the fall of Rome, England was taken over by the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, and those were Germanic tribes who were barbaric, and so the Christian religion of the Roman Empire was kind of snuffed out in England, but they didn't make it to Ireland, just like how the Romans didn't make it to Ireland. The Irish were too good of fighters, I guess, and defended themselves. So the Christian religion got to keep going strong, and they have a very long list of very famous Christian priests and preachers and religious leaders in that period of time between the fall of Rome, like 400, 450, and when the Vikings came. So then, when the Vikings came, that changed things again and made it a new Ireland. In the year 792, I think it was, the island of Lindisfarne, which is off the coast of Scotland, was taken over by the Vikings from Denmark and Norway, and they found that to be easy pickings. So then they went over and just took over all of Northern Europe. That's when the Vikings founded Moscow and Kiev, and because they had these seafaring boats that could then go up rivers, and they took over even France and started the Norman Kingdom, duchy, and took over a lot of Scotland and England. That's where the Legend of King Arthur came in, and the Netflix show. They even have a Netflix show about also King Alfred was the last remaining British kingdom in England. So they went over and they took over a lot of Ireland as well, and so it changed the DNA of Ireland, and it also changed the culture of Ireland because the Vikings were very good seafarers with their big longboats. And Thomas McGee wrote in the book that on a good day, with fair winds, the Vikings could get from Norway, where they came from. Some of their major cities in Norway back in the good old days were Trondheim and Oslo and in Denmark. They could get from up there in Scandinavia all the way to Ireland in 3 days. So when you see Vikings, the TV show, and they're like, okay, let's go over and raid England again, and then they show them in the water, and then the next thing they're back in England. It's kind of like that. They just got in their boats and they rode and sailed their asses off, and in 3 days they got there. It's not really that far. So there was a lot of communication going on. So they took over, and they used their boats to go to Ireland, but then up the rivers into Ireland. And Ireland has a lot of rivers. I was looking at on Google Earth. They're covered in lakes. It's very lush. It's very green because it rains a lot. The ocean, the way that the weather patterns go, is it pushes all of the water from the storms from the equator and the Atlantic Ocean up into Ireland and Britain. So Ireland and Britain are a lot warmer than other places in the world that are that far north, like Canada. You picture Canada being freezing cold, but not so much Ireland and England, even though they're so far north. But they're getting rained on all the time, so it's lush. But there's lots of rivers and lakes. So they would do their boats up the rivers and take people over. They would come in huge packs of boats, like 60 boats at a time. They had one invasion they estimated that was 4,000 people. So to give an idea of what 4,000 people is on boats, those are all, rowers in an army, basically. These were warriors, not like families. They were coming over there to raid and take over. In ancient Rome, 4,000 is about a legion. So that's what in ancient Rome, what an army would be. That's about as big of an army that you can kind of manage. I went to a college with 4,000 people, and, if your hair is wacky and wild enough, you're original enough, you can kind of be known to the whole school or the whole group with 4,000 people. So it's that's the biggest cohesive unit led by one person, pretty much, that you you can have. So they had, so when they came over, they took over. Um, I think I think I read in the book maybe one of them there were even 120 boats that came over. So it was a full-fledged invasion. A lot of the leaders of these Vikings that took over Ireland and England, um, their names are famous in the Viking lore. But if you look for their names in the history of Scandinavia, you don't find them. So these are guys who made their fame on the high seas. They weren't. It wasn't like an organized invasion from a big kingdom in Scotland in Scandinavia. I remember reading about one Viking, and his story was that he was the king of some kingdom, but then he got ousted. So there must have been some kind of overpopulation from warm weather where they could overpopulate in Scandinavia, and then there was a little ice age that just squeezed people out, and so they came down south. Also, they weren't afraid of the Roman Empire anymore. There wasn't a Roman Empire. The Vikings came right at the end of Charlemagne. Um, so that was kind of, and Charlemagne never even really learned to read or write. So it's kind of the Dark Ages. So, um, so if, mixing the Dark Ages with just religious people in Ireland, it was kind of an easy, I guess, easy time for them to come over and take over. So they came over and they started different kingdoms in Ireland. Dublin was the city of Dublin was founded by Vikings, and so that kingdom was I think the kingdom of Mide. On my timeline, I only have one. Um, Here, I'll show my timeline on on my computer here. So those are the different counties of Ireland. So here's my timeline for 500 to 1,000. Kingdom of Mide started in 743, and I think that was a Viking. A Viking town. So let's see here. Yeah, I don't have it. So there, that was kind of the beginning of lots of more of a fighting in Ireland. So then that happened for a couple hundred years, and then when the Normans took over England, they also went into Ireland and took over Ireland, a lot of Ireland, and this is where the book kind of got boring to me. It was hard to follow, but they were pretty brutal with each other. They would when the Vikings came over, they brought new system of government, which was a lot more barbaric than what they had. Like they would, if you couldn't pay your debts back, they would cut your nose off. They would, they were the guys who would, tie you up in bags and throw you in the ocean and, cut your head off and put it on a pike. And so there were lots of stories of that going on. Okay, so then let's fast forward to the next part of Ireland, and that was when Ireland. So Ireland had a lot of their own Celtic kingdoms still that it still existed, although and they were pretty much a distinct like racial group and language group, all the way up until Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the person who began taking over Ireland. And that's when stuff got kind of bad for Ireland, because England and Ireland were different races, but there were also different religions. Henry VIII was the king who made England Protestant, because he wanted to divorce his Spanish wife so he could marry and Anne Boleyn, and Ireland stayed Catholic. Ireland was friendly to the Catholics because ever since the 400s when Saint Patrick brought Christianity over there, so they they fought back against England, and the English called them papists. If you were a Catholic, you were called papist, and they made all kinds of rules against papists and Catholics in Ireland. They kind of tied it in together as one thing, and they were started treating Irish as second class citizens. We think of today as us being racist against black people, but it was basically you know just as bad against the Irish. They had laws. Once England took over, they had laws that if you were a native Irish person, you couldn't live within 5 miles from an English city, and they had a lot less rights. And when England had their civil war in 1650 with Oliver Cromwell, a lot of the big battles took place in Ireland because the Irish were. I think Oliver Cromwell was they were fighting. It was Catholics against Protestants for a long time. It didn't just end with Henry VIII. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth, there were some coups against her because she was Protestant. And then the Spaniards sent their armada of 600 ships to try to take over England partly because they were Protestant. And then the queen after Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, she killed like 300 people, burned 300 people at the stake because they were Protestant. She made it Catholic again. And then after her, Queen Mary was right before Elizabeth. And so it was Henry VIII who was Protestant, and then his daughter Mary made it Catholic again, but then her sister Elizabeth made it Protestant again, and so they were fighting Catholics against Protestants for a long time, up until Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s. And some of the most brutal battles, Catholics versus Protestants, were in Ireland, where a lot of, I think like 1 million Irish people died. There were some really bad battles, Battle of Clonarth, and the most brutal. And at one point, when they killed and took over the Catholic Irish, they sent 12,000 of them to the East Indies and Virginia as slaves. Thomas McGee called them slaves. When I read the Wikipedia article, they called them indentured servants. But according to the book, Thomas McGee, they were sent there as slaves, and so that was interesting to me because I picture slaves in America as just being blacks, and and it was easy to make black people slaves because you can just look at somebody's color of their skin, and so they distinguished who was a slave in the West Indies and Bermuda and Virginia by putting a big black dot on tattooing a big black dot on their cheek, and so. And then the brutality against the Irish continued after that. Ireland had a big famine in 1740, which killed like 100,000 people or something. And then there was a huge famine from 1845 to 1845 to 49 in Ireland called the Great Irish Famine, which killed like 400,000 people of starvation, and 150,000 more had to flee Ireland, and that was a big exodus of Irish to America. And a lot of people say that the famine was started by a little ice age where the potatoes wouldn't grow. Potatoes originally came Ireland in the good old days. They would get their sustenance from cows and pigs and grain, but after England with Sir Walter Raleigh went over to the Americas, they brought back potatoes from America and tobacco and other things, Queen Elizabeth smoked tobacco after they brought it back, got addicted to that. But yeah, potatoes was one of the food that they brought back. But the potatoes all froze when there's an ice age. I guess it's outside of its natural habitat. And so that's why the people starved in 1740 and 41. There was an exodus. And then the big potato blight of 1845 to 49 killed all the Irish. But in those days, Ireland was part of England. It was part of the whole island was part of the English Empire. But the Irish were a second-class citizen. And the Irish were being ruled by absentee landlords. So it was kind of like France under Louis the 17th, where you'd have Versailles with 10,000 lords from all over France. Louis the 14th brought all of the lords from all over France to Versailles so he could centralize the government and have control over them. But what that did was it created absentee landlordism. So there was all these people living in Versailles, but they actually owned the land in all parts of France. So they were just like leeches sucking the money out and not having any kind of representative government. And so that was what was going on in Ireland. England was just giving these big tracts of land to lords in England, and the lords would only go and look at the tracts of land, thousands, like 50,000 acres, that they owned like once or twice in their lifetime. But for all intents and purposes, that land was just there to send its resources back to England. Like, so they were just leeching off of Ireland. And then they made all these laws to make the Irish more and more poor, like making it so the actual Irish, the actual Celtic original real Irish, could only own like less than an acre of land, and they were expected to feed their whole family on less than an acre of land with potatoes. And they devised all kinds of taxes that didn't make any sense. Like they had a air tax. That's why a lot of the windows in old buildings in Ireland are so small, because they had a light tax. If you wanted to have a big window, that meant a lot of light, so they would tax you. So it was really unfair. And with the absentee landlordism, they had this certain quota. They treated Ireland kind of like like with ancient Rome, when they would colonize, and they would have a big battle with another kingdom, and they would colonize the kingdom, and then they would go in and bring one of their governors over there to manage it, and they would have the certain taxes that they would have to bring back to Rome, and they would tax too much, but they couldn't do anything about it because the army was controlled by Rome. It was kind of like that. They had a certain quota of taxes that they had to bring back to England, and then the tax man, who was British, could just kind of tax whatever he wanted, and was just leeching him. So they said that the Irish back in the 1850s, they were the poorest people in all of Europe. Their houses couldn't even withstand the rainstorms or the winter, because they just lived in little huts on tiny tracts of land, and had nothing. So it caused a lot of rebellions and wars and hatred between the two countries. And so when the famine came, they kept the same quotas. They had ledgers that showed that there were still like thousands of cows and meat and potatoes and stuff still being shipped back to England while the famine was going on and all the Irish were dying. Right before the potato famine, in 1845, there were 8.8 million Irish people living in Ireland. And then when they did the census again, like at the end of the 1800s, there were only 4 million people living there. So it got chopped by like in half the population, because it was mismanaged by England and they all starved to death. And so that's and then when they came to America, they weren't really treated that well either. They were kind of looked down on as dirty Irish, and so it was kind of like the poor Irish against the Italians. And so They finally got their independence in 1922, right after World War One, and then they wrote their Constitution in 1937. So Ireland is less than 100 years old, and I think that's why there's still a lot of you know strife in Northern Ireland, because England still owns the northern part of Ireland, and so that is my rundown. Oh, I did it only in 35 minutes. Great. Of the History of Ireland by Thomas McGee. It's super, super boring because they just talk about if you want to read the book one is really interesting, because that's when they're talking about the ancient Ireland, and he talks about, maybe I think book two, they talk about the Vikings and the Viking religion with Valhalla, and how it's different than the Christian Ireland that was more civilized. It kind of took a step back, but after the Vikings came in the year 800, Ireland became a lot better seafarers. They took the technology of the Vikings, and they started using boats more, and boats up the rivers. And there's this saying, by hook or by crook. We're gonna do it by hook or by crook. That means we're gonna keep our land or take your land no matter what. And that saying comes from when some of these Viking settlements started fighting each other and for land. They were bringing their boats up the rivers with hooks. The hook is one thing you can put around a sheep to pull them around, but I think they also did it with their boats. They pull their boats up these little rivers, and then when they become little rivers, they would just drag them over land. And I think crook was a name for a tiny little river. So it just shows how their ambition, that they could get all over the island in their big armies and their boats. So okay, so I think in my next book I'm gonna do Diogenes. That's a philosophy book. It's a lot easier than History of Ireland. I might stagger it, a history book and then a philosophy book, just to keep it fresh in my mind. And then there's a book about a Spaniard who went across South America in the 1500s that I'm going to do. Whew. All righty. Talk to you later.